بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Assalamu alaikum. It's good. Inshallah, I'm going to be reciting some verses from Surah Fussilat, Ayah 30 and to Ayah 35, inshallah. And there will be a translation, بإذن الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. إن الذين قالوا ربنا الله ثم استقاموا تتنزل عليهم الملائكة ألا تخافوا ولا تحزنوا وأبشروا بالجنة التي كنتم توعدون. نحن أولياؤكم في الحياة الدنيا وفي الآخرة ولكم فيها ما تشتهي أنفسكم ولكم فيها ما تدعون نزلا من غفور رحيم. ومن أحسن قولا ممن دعا إلى الله وعمل صالحا ومن أحسن قولا ممن دعا إلى الله وعمل صالحا وقال إنني من المسلمين. ولا تستوي الحسنة ولا السيئة ادفع بالتي هي أحسن فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم. ولا تستوي الحسنة ولا السيئة ادفع بالتي هي أحسن فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم وما يلقاها إلا الذين صبروا وما يلقاها إلا ذو حظ عظيم صدق الله العظيم.
Jazakallah khair, Imam Kari Amar, Jazakallah khair. Translation. In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. As for those who say, our Lord is God, and are upright, the angels will descend upon them. Do not fear, but rejoice in the garden that you have been promised. We are your helpers in the life of the world and in the hereafter, where you will have whatever your souls desire, and you will have whatever you ask for, as hospitality from one most forgiving, most merciful. Who is more eloquent than one who invites to God and acts with integrity, saying, I am one of those who acquiesce to God. For good and evil are not equal. Promote what is better, and then one between you and whom there was enmity will be as friend, a relative. But no one will be offered that but those who have been constant, and no one will be offered that but one of great good fortune. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace, and a warm welcome to you all and to all those who have joined us online. We gather tonight to reflect upon the recent events in the Muslim world, what's largely called the Arab world, Muslim world, and beyond, including what is happening right here at home. I'm very grateful to our hosts, Zaytuna College, for providing the space to us and for inviting us in co-sponsorship of this event with the Center for Race and Gender at UC Berkeley, namely the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project, which Dr. Hatem Bazian directs. It is also co-sponsored by the Center for Islamic Studies here right at the Graduate Theological Union, and I'm Munir Jiwa, the director of the Center for Islamic Studies. Today we'll hear from each of our panelists, and none of them are strangers to you, a very distinguished panel, and I want to start actually with Sister Marianne Farina at the Dominican School, who's actually not here tonight because she's actually teaching a course on Christian-Muslim dialogue. So her class is there, and if they're finished early enough, they might join us. But we also want to acknowledge her and the great work that she's doing, and she is here with us in spirit and sends greetings. We also have Imam Zaid Shakir, Dr. Hatem Bazian, Professor Tolan, President Jim Donahue of the GTU, and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who will be introduced by Professor Tolan a bit later. I want to invite now Rashida Plenty, a third-year at Zaytuna student, who will read a statement of Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya, after which I'll make some opening remarks, and then we'll have a chance to hear from the panelists, followed by discussion. I also want to remind our online community that we will have a chance to engage with their questions as well at the end. So a warm welcome to Sister Rashida.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه. This statement was issued by Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, Vice Chairman of the International Union of Muslim Scholars, President of the Global Center for Renewal and Guidance, and Professor of Islamic Jurisprudence at the King Abdulaziz University, Jeddah. Thursday, September 13th, 2012, the 26th of Shawwal, 1433. The days and nights pass, as do the centuries and successive generations, and your light ever shines, and the fragrance of your remembrance perfuses throughout. Your gentle rain descends on all the continents, and your call to humanity remains timeless and universal. O humanity, be dutiful to your Lord, who created you from a single soul. Far be it for the vile to block the light of the sun. How can the foul stream unsettle the pure water of life? Rabid dogs bark at the moon, yet the caravan proceeds. They are the enemies of peace, the enemies of prosperity, the enemies of humanity. To our prophet, we know your disparagers were referring to someone else, a product of their vile imagination. They are not worthy of mentioning by name, and we care not to speak to them. Rather, we address people of reason and understanding. We address our brothers and sisters in faith and belief, and we address Muslims of shared humanity with these three thoughts. First, to people of reason and understanding, we ask all of you to ponder deeply the volatile ramifications of a small group provoking the sentiments of over 1 billion people, a group that desires neither peace nor fraternity to spread on the earth. This poses a threat to world peace with no tangible benefit retained. It is not necessary in today's world for the United Nations, is it not necessary in today's world for the United Nations to issue a resolution criminalizing the denigration of religious symbols and the provocation of religious hatred? We request all religious and political authorities, as well as people of reason, to join us in putting a stop to this foolishness that brings no benefit. Second, to the world's Muslims, expressing outrage in the face of the maligning of God or the Prophet Muhammad is a moral right, as faith cannot be devoid of sensibilities and is not immune from provocation. It is from the completeness of our faith that we love the Prophet Muhammad more than our wealth, more than our beloveds, more than even our own selves. It is from our complete love of him that we follow God's commands, specifically where he says, "And do not let hatred of a people prevent you from being just. Be just, as it is closer to God consciousness. And no soul bears the sin of another. And he who kills a soul not in recompense for another soul or in retribution for the sowing of corruption is as if he has killed all of humanity." Consequently, we implore you not to aggress upon anyone, whether foreign delegations or otherwise. You should not destroy property or flout the values and cherished principles that you defend. For surely, attacking innocents and killing foreign diplomats and ambassadors is first and foremost a violation of religious and moral principles before it is a violation of political ones. It is important that we do not forget the Prophet Muhammad's praise for those who exercise restraint when feeling angry. You should prevent those individuals who behave recklessly from actions that are irrational and immoral. We ask the Muslim youth to be disciplined in word and deed and rise appropriately to the occasion. We call upon Muslim religious authorities, governments, community and organization leaders to devise a strategy to deal with such situations in the future, as these situations are likely to reoccur. So it is important to manage the conflict before it manages us. We call upon Friday prayer congregations to perform the prayer and to seek blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad, and to send requests through proper channels to the heads of the international community about the seriousness of the situation and its need to be addressed. Third, to our Western neighbors. Our Lord has enjoined us to respect and treat equitably our neighbors, regardless of race or religious affiliation. The Messiah, Jesus Christ, also enjoined love of neighbor. We will remain forever neighbors. We cannot imagine any reasonable person concluding that it would be possible for either of us to disappear from the face of the earth. Therefore, why shouldn't we cooperate to establish effective neighborly relations in an effort to create space for mutual liberty and prosperity? We are profoundly troubled by the small, active minority in your countries that seeks a perpetual state of conflict and war. Such actions do not serve the general interest. Therefore, it is our hope that you reconsider and criminalize the hateful denigration of sacred symbols and deem such provocations outside the rational framework of freedom of expression, a framework that you hold so dearly, as do we. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Rashida. I just want to open with a few comments and then quickly turn it over to our esteemed panelists. As you know, the last few days have been filled with emails circulating, media stories, a lot of hype, a lot of reflection, a lot of prayer that many of us have been doing about the sort of nature of the events, both in the Middle East, the Muslim world, and here. It's interesting that the title, Between Militarism and Extremism, the Excluded Middle, a lot of us have been called, I think, to talk about the violence out there, but I would argue that a lot of what we're experiencing is really about what's going on here. And it's violence often masks, I think, some of the real issues that are at stake. One, which is this idea that freedom of expression is absolute and that it's equal at all times and it pertains to everyone at all times. And our panelists will speak to the fact that that's hardly true. We very often pick and choose when freedom of expression is acceptable and when it isn't. One of the things that this immediately reminds us of as well is that this is put in the context of Salman Rushdie, who's also commented on the film, which has supposedly sparked these protests and spread them throughout the Muslim world. We've also seen the conversations of this film, The Innocence of Muslims, being put in the context of the Danish cartoons, Park 51, the Quran burning. So all sort of media spectacles through which we think about globalized Islam. And many of the Muslim organizations, interfaith organizations, civic organizations have put out statements. They will be available for you to pick up in the foyer, so please help yourselves to that. But a few of the things that I've been thinking about, and hopefully we'll pick them up during the discussion, is this idea of provocation. Just because you have the right to freedom of expression and the right to insult, does it make it right to do so? The other major point that I've had to think about, and I thought about it a lot during the Danish cartoons, is this idea that Muslims in particular, amongst all people of faith, are especially sensitive to issues around religion or the Quran, which is the word of God, or demeaning the Prophet. And what I would argue is that it's actually a mistaken understanding of Islam. In fact, it's not that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is exempt from critique, or that he is above and beyond, or that he is quote-unquote, divine-like. But in fact, it's his everydayness in Muslim life that makes this so palpable and tangible for Muslims. So that it's not his extraordinariness, but in fact, in some ways, his ordinariness that Muslims try to, from the time of their birth, try to embody as part of their daily lives. So what we call religious injury, I would argue here, is really everyday injury. That we are, in fact, close to the Prophet, he's closer to us than our parents, and therefore we feel this as a personal injury, as if someone was making fun of us, as making fun of our mother or father, our uncles or aunts. So the Prophet is that close to us. So this attack on the Prophet in some ways is in fact an attack on our person. And how many of us wouldn't resort to some kind of anger? So you can understand, I'm not justifying the violence, but you can understand the response one would have if one's family member was being called names or insulted. The famous line that I find really interesting and curious is Salman Rushdie, when his publication came out, and as you've noticed throughout the ages, throughout time, these public defamations of the Prophet have just sunk into the most obscene presentations. First, we have what might be called high culture, this literature, this book, Satanic Verses. Then we have the Danish cartoons, which are caricatures of the Prophet in cartoon form. And then we have this film, which is mildly pornographic. So we can see that just over time, that the depictions are getting worse and worse, and they're bound to get worse. So we have to find a way in which to respond, both as Muslim communities, as communities of other faith traditions, and as humanity. But what I find curious is that Salman Rushdie, many years ago, couldn't understand why his book, The Satanic Verses, caused so much outrage amongst Muslims, and that Muslims should be disciplined into a better response or a better reading of his book. And he couldn't quite understand that personal injury. And one of the interesting things is a few years ago, a journalist at a party in New York had made fun of his then fiancée, Padma Lakshmi, and had made fun of her in the way in which she was dressed and other things. And he threatened the journalist with a baseball bat. He said, "I will come get you with a baseball bat." And it's I use this as an example just to highlight that when there's personal attack or personal injury, one is very quick to defend oneself, one's partner, one's family member. And so I use this, I think, as a way in which to think through this idea of Muslim exceptionalism, that somehow we're more sensitive to religious injury. And what I would argue is this is actually everyday injury, because Islam is not something abstract that happens once a week or once a year, but is in fact inhabited and lived as part of one's everyday life. So without further ado, I would like to actually introduce our speaker and moderator for this evening, Sandy Tolan, to whom we're very grateful for coming up from USC. He's a radio and a print journalist and associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communications at USC. Amongst his numerous publications, he is the author of The Lemon Tree, An Arab, a Jew, and the Heart of the Middle East, and he blogs at ramallahcafe.com. So welcome.
Thanks. Assalamu alaikum. Nice to be here. Thank you. I'm really honored to be asked to be among this esteemed group and among all of you tonight, and very happy to be back in Berkeley, where I taught at the journalism school just down the street for on and off for 7 years until the end of 2007. So I want to thank Zaytuna College, Dr. Munir Jiwa, and others for inviting me here and making my arrival so effortless. So thank you. I thought I really heard a lot of what Dr. Munir Jiwa was saying in terms of the sense of hurt and the sense of a call for something to re-examine free speech, the whole notion of free speech. As a journalist, I have conflicting feelings about that, and I really look forward to a discussion about that with the panelists later on. I've been thinking about it a lot in preparation for tonight. I thought it might be useful to set a little bit of the context. I'm sure generally what I'm saying is not going to be lost on anyone. I think most people have been following this, so I won't go into great detail. But just since the posting of this video of the innocence of Muslims in Arabic, and perhaps not coincidentally, also something we can visit, since this past September 11th, unrest has spread to 20 countries: Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Tunisia, Morocco, Sudan, other countries. 65 embassies or consulates under alleged threat, Marines sent to protect embassies in Yemen and Sudan, dozens of deaths. But some reports say that the assault in Benghazi also appeared planned and complex rather than a spontaneous outbreak of mob violence in reaction to an online video. So that's another issue that we can discuss later. Is this more of a power struggle in the wake of the Arab uprising? Commentators in U.S. mainstream media suggest that these might be more extremist challenges to ruling parties in Libya and Egypt. Hani Shukrallah, the great Egyptian journalist and director of Al Ahram Online in Cairo, he was a visiting fellow here 6 years ago at the J School at Berkeley, and a friend of mine wrote just a few days ago, the Prophet Muhammad is in fact wholly secondary to the real motives of the various parties to the ugly and bloody brawl. So we'll explore this as we go along. Whatever the truth of that, and there are a lot of opinions about it obviously, and the truth I think remains murky in many cases, the violence has claimed dozens of lives. And let's start with one, just a few words about one, J. Christopher Stevens, the U.S. ambassador to Libya, who after all was a child of the East Bay, one of our own here in Berkeley. He grew up in Piedmont, he graduated from Piedmont High, a Berkeley graduate in 1982, Hastings Law in 1989, joined the Foreign Service a couple of years later at 31 years old. He liked to play tennis, he liked to hike California trails, he loved the LA Lakers. The New York Times article about him a few days ago talked about him as revered for listening, a passion for the Arab world and its language. He went out of his way to use it, whether with officials or shopkeepers, in an effort to show respect, comfort with his environment. He was one of the U.S.'s foremost Arabists who built a bridge to the tribes and militias that toppled Muammar Gaddafi. He even signed his emails Krees, K-R-E-E-S, because that was the way that his name was pronounced to many who were his friends and associates in the world he lived in. He was someone who was able to live in that place completely, according to one of the people who was quoted. A rare diplomat, according to Diana Boutou, the former Fatah spokesperson who is a lawyer and a brilliant analyst of Palestinian affairs, Palestinian lawyer herself, who listened rather than dictated to Palestinians. Rare for American diplomats, indeed. LA Times reported this banner on the streets of Benghazi just a couple of days ago. Sorry, people of America, this is not the behavior of our Islam and Prophet. There are also effects on the U.S. presidential election, which I won't go into now, but you obviously saw the exchange between Governor Mitt Romney and President Obama and the Obama administration. At first it appeared that Mr. Romney was actually defending the film. Then he went off ahead and said that he thought the whole thing was a terrible idea. We can talk about some of the U.S. political implications as well, of course, as getting into the whole question of free speech, which I think is an extremely rich one at this moment and in these past few years for discussion. There are many ways of looking at this, and I'm looking forward to talking to you all about it and to discussing it with my colleagues. So I think beyond these free speech issues, there's the issue of context. What are the political, historical, and religious underpinnings that would help us explain what's happening and why, and that's why many of us are here tonight. Of course, it's possible to seek to explain, to understand, to explore this broader context without stepping into the George W. Bushian trap of for us or against us. Indeed, this theme of tonight's talk between militarism and extremism, the excluded middle, and the esteemed colleagues sitting right here beside me present an opportunity to explore the context and substantial and largely ignored middle ground where thoughtful, rational thought and feelings abound. So here we are, and it's my honor to introduce our four panelists this evening who will each speak for a bit, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then I'll open the floor to you all And because there's so many people here, and because perhaps also opinions are strongly held quite often on issues such as these, I would ask you to please make your questions short, and please refrain if you feel like you're starting to make a speech, hold it for later. Okay, first of all, Dr. James Donahue is the 7th president of the Graduate Theological Union and the first GTU alumnus to serve in this position. Before returning to the GTU in 2000, Dr. Donahue served as a professor of theology and ethics, dean of students, and vice president of student affairs at Georgetown University for 15 years. He has also held faculty and administrative positions at Boston College and Santa Clara University. Dr. Donahue's primary research and teaching interests include ethics and religion in public life, organizational and professional ethics, and issues of moral and religious identity for individuals and institutions. He is the co-author of Ethics Across the Curriculum, a practice-based approach, and is currently writing The Construction of Identity in an Interreligious World. He is co-editor of Religion, Ethics, and the Common Good. Dr. Hatem Bazian received his PhD in philosophy and Islamic studies from the University of California, Berkeley. Currently, Bazian is a senior lecturer at the Department of Near Eastern and Ethnic Studies, and of course, he's a co-founder of Zaytuna College. Imam Zaid Shakir is amongst the most respected and influential Islamic scholars in the West. He is co-founder of Zaytuna College, the Tri-State Muslim Educational Institute, and the Connecticut Muslim Coordinating Committee. Hamza Yusuf is co-founder of Zaytuna College, located right here in Berkeley, right here in this space. He is an advisor to Stanford University's Program in Islamic Studies and the Center for Islamic Studies at Berkeley's Graduate Theological Union. In addition, he serves as vice president for the Global Center for Guidance and Renewal, which was founded and is currently presided over by Abdullah bin Bayah, one of the top jurists and masters of Islamic sciences in the world. So these are our colleagues who are here to speak with us, and without further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Donahue to come up. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. It is a pleasure to be here. I wish we didn't have to be here, but we are here, and our job of the panel is to try to both clarify and maybe provide some resources for helping us think through this very difficult time that we're experiencing, given everything that's been happening in the Middle East and in our country as well. I want to be very targeted in what I say. I wear 3 particular hats, and I would like to speak about the recent events and the impact of those events and what I think some appropriate responses are to those events from the context of those hats I wear. I believe at the end of the day, we all act out of our context. And thinking through what our context requires and asks of us is absolutely critical to thinking through this particular set of challenges we face right now. The 3 hats I wear is that I am the president of an academic graduate school, the Graduate Theological Union. I am also the president of a consortium of theological schools, the Graduate Theological Union, each school of which, and there are 9 schools and also centers. Every school and center has a set of confessional commitments, a set of beliefs that animate their work, that animate their mission, and that really provide the framework for what it is that they do. And so as a president of that consortium, I'd like to speak a little bit about how I understand what the recent events require of us to do. And the 3rd hat I wear is that I'm a professor of ethics and social ethics here at the GTU as well, and have been throughout my professional career. So I want to take each of those hats and just say a very few targeted words meant to maybe be more provocative and thought-provoking than certainly to solve and resolve the issues at hand. I want to be clear that I do not consider myself, nor am I an expert on Islamic studies and Middle East affairs, etc., but I think speaking out of our context begins to help shape for me what I will call the imperatives that the context in which I live, and perhaps you live as well, require. The first context, the GTU is an academic graduate school. And what do academic graduate schools or academic institutions, whether it be undergraduate or graduate, what do? They're engaged in academic discourse in the world of ideas, and as our student speaker spoke so eloquently earlier, engaged in the world of reason, thought, analysis, and dialogue. Reason and dialogue shape our world. And I don't presume that there is one world, there are multiple worlds, multiple communities, and I'm just going to presume that we understand that. The kind of reason we bring to thinking through the issues at play is absolutely critical. And there's a lot of understandings of what reason is, the separation between reason and emotion and politics and economics and all the dimensions of reason, intuition, etc., are really critical. But reason and dialogue are at the core of what academic institutions do. And therefore, one of the imperatives for any academic institution is to think reasonably, clearly, critically about the issues at hand. And you don't have to be around educational institutions for very long to realize that sometimes they don't think rationally or coherently about a lot of things, but that being, bracket that for a while. The imperative for a place like the GTU and all of us in education is to understand what the rational dimensions of the issues at hand are, and then use that reason to look for solutions and resolutions. I would also say that, particularly at the Graduate Theological Union, that we don't see reason, nor do I see reason, as something that is abstract and ahistorical and hovering above reality in some impractical way. Reason is engaged and flows out of what it is that we practice and how we practice. And so any academic institution worth its salt is going to understand the relationship between reason, dialogue, and the world of practical reality. The role of education is to have some relevance to what is going on in the practical world. So that's my hat as an academic, as the head of an academic graduate school. I'm also involved with the Graduate Theological Union, which is a consortium of theological schools, as I said, each of which is faith-based, has a set of confessional commitments, and really is animated by a set of beliefs that give life and meaning and mission to what it is that we do. The GTU is a remarkable institution, and a little bit of self-promotion. We're 50 years old this year, and I think our history is distinctive and compelling, and I know those of us that are part of this community are very proud of that. I think one of the roles of an institution, and I would say this both for an academic institution as well as for a consortium of theological schools, is to be a model for how we think and how we are. And the Graduate Theological Union began 50 years ago as bringing together a set of, at that time, mainly Christian denominational graduate schools of theology and seminaries, and then evolving into one that is explicitly interreligious, engaged with faith traditions and not just the ecumenics of the Christian tradition. But there is at our core, and has always been at the GTU, a respect for one another's difference, one another's confessional beliefs, and understanding that we are far better and far more understanding of what we believe by virtue of engaging in dialogue with those who believe otherwise. And we do that in a community of respect, and I would call it a community in which civility becomes the critical component. And it seems to me one of the imperatives that we are looking at today in terms of responding to the issues at hand is understanding what that civility requires. We have always seen ourselves at the GTU as a community that seeks to bridge differences. Differences are real, they're important, they make us who we are, they identify us as individuals and communities in different kinds of ways. And the point is to figure out how we bridge those differences. And it doesn't take much to understand that we need a lot of understanding of how to bridge differences in this day and age, given the situation at hand that we're here to respond to tonight. So the main essence of my thought here is that educational institutions, be they theological or academic or whatever, their role and the imperative is for them to be educational and not to become something other than they are, not to be ivory towerish, not to be political entities necessarily, but to understand how they are going to combine the different dimensions of what it means to be communities, be they academic or theological, in some coherent way. The third hat I wear is as a professor of ethics and professor of ethics at the GTU. And my fellow panelists will speak much more eloquently and in depth to this, but I just want to kind of throw out a teaser with regard to the issue of one of the obvious phenomena that is at hand, how we understand free speech and the ethics of free speech, and how we understand what its limits are, what its boundaries are, what its constraints are. And I'm just going to be very brief to say that at the core of certainly liberal democracies, and I mean that in a sort of a political context, not a politicized context, that free speech is at the core of who we are and our ability to express ourselves and to be articulate about our commitments is absolutely critical. And so whatever we say, whatever we make of the films, the ideas, the words that are being used, the images that are being used, however we think of that, it's critical to understand that those rights of free speech are core to how one understands liberal democracy. Are they absolute? No. And what it really requires in order to understand the limits of free speech is to understand what the appropriate proportionality is of the extent of free speech, the extent of our abilities to speak, and the impacts that has on others, particularly as it relates to the potentialities for violence. So you put free speech and violence in some correlated, balanced way. One of the particular issues, and I'll end by saying this, that one of the particular challenges that we have to contend with in this current situation is to understand how we assess the potentiality for violence. We can say that, well, if you say that, it's going to lead to perhaps violence. How do we know that? How do we assess that? How do we gauge that? That is an issue that needs to be clarified, needs to be analyzed and thought through very, very clearly, and it's the role of educational institutions to do that. And with that, I would like to just kind of hope that our conversation will lead to some thoughtful solutions to how we might, in our own particular contexts, whatever they might be, can do something and act in ways that are consistent with who we are and what we believe. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's really a pleasure to see everybody coming and joining us in this event. We put the announcement for the event on Friday, and it shows the interest, the intense need for us to have such a conversation at such a critical time in the history, not only of the United States, but the history of the world that we all are living in. Just like Professor Donahue said, he had multiple hats, so I'm going to say the hats that I'm wearing today. I do chair the American Muslims for Palestine nationally. I'm also the co-founder of Zaytuna College and also the director of the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at UC Berkeley. So let me first actually make two issues very clear about the documentary or the video that is out there. Initially, it wanted to lay the blame for the film on Israel or the Jewish community. It said that the producer is an American Israeli, and the second that it was funded by 100 Jews. Both are completely incorrect. We cannot lay the blame on Israel or the Jewish population for this video. And this is coming from Palestinian, and I have a lot of beef that I could take with the Israel perspective, but this film does not represent any of those, and I think we need to be clear. And for those who are joining us online, I don't want to see any of the nonsense online about who is behind this video. All those who produced the video, who put it out, belong to an extreme right wing in this country, that they don't have the Palestinian best interest in mind, nor they have the Jewish best interest in mind, and I think we need to be clear about this. I think both I've been assigned the task, or I took the task of dealing with Islamophobia, and I think my two co-founders of Zaytuna College will tackle other parts, but I think it's important for us to speak about Islamophobia. Islamophobia essentially deals with all Muslims as a homogeneous population and casts Islam and Muslims as a threat. It says that Islam and Muslims have nothing in common with Western society and Western values. It also has a whole characterization of negatives assigned to Muslims in general. And I think there has been a massive Islamophobic production in our country. You just have to see the switch, in whether it's in the movies, on TV, on any of the discourses, you'll find that Islam and Islamophobia is right there as center stage. And I think we need to begin tackle this systematically. And just like you have a movie production industry, there is an Islamophobic production industry that is dedicated to demeaning, to speaking ill of Muslims, and attempting to sideline Muslims from civil society and civil discourse. And I think it's about time for us to take this seriously. Just a few months back, there was a report about Fear Inc., which actually demonstrated in a very systematic research by Wajahat Ali and few other people who researched that there are about $46 million that have been spent on trying to produce the Muslim menace, the Muslim threat. And until we are able to recognize the various aspects of how Islamophobia function in order to create a massive fear, to authenticate a clash of civilization. And I still agree with Edward Said when he says there is no clash of civilization, there is a clash of ignorance. And that's basically what we're dealing with, is a clash of ignorance. There are ignorant people in our own society in here, and there are ignorant people out there. And that's why our discussion today is about the middle, meaning the overwhelming population of both the American society and the Muslim world that really is not included in the conversation. Now, let me deal a little bit more specifically with Islamophobia after 9/11. As we understand, the Islamophobic discourse after 9/11 wanted to lay blame that the problems that we're facing in the world is really could be put at the step door of the Muslim world and the Muslim population, and wanting to see Muslims in this country as a threat, saying that we have sleeper cells. And I always say that we have sleeper cells in the mosque, but they're sleeping, not for anything or any ill intent. This essentially said that all the Muslims in our own American society, and just I remember, I teach Muslims in America, and my students are tweeting right now, Muslims have been in this country since the early period, even at the time of Columbus. The first Muslim slave that was brought into this country is 1502, and he actually ran away and made company with the Native Americans. And the first exclusionary act in this country, in this continent, were in 1526, directed at Muslims who were being brought as slaves, and that exclusionary act was renewed 5 times over a period of 50 years. So meaning that we're not new to this continent, we have been in this place, but there is an intent to try to isolate, to put the Muslims on the side. From those who are working on Islamophobia, they believe that the more hatred we have of Muslims in here, the more that we have reflexive hatred of Muslims abroad, thus authorizing or making the need for military action and the death and destruction more palatable to us without having to think that we are actually killing humans. And therefore, Islamophobic discourse in this country is about othering Muslims in order to, once again, bring into fruition a military-industrial complex that see more weapons, more death machine as the best way for us to move forward. And I think we need to change the discourse altogether and to work on building bridges, not on otherizing people, but actually treating people on equal footing, on respect, on honoring the dignity of people both here and across the world. Now, let me shift a little bit to speak about some of the outfits that have been increasing and producing Islamophobia. Many of you have been aware of the ad campaign that has been running in San Francisco buses. It's been produced by Pamela Geller, and today she's going to put another ad in San Francisco. Pamela Geller represents a very narrow spectrum in the United States, and she has pursued a strategy of using these wedge issues in order to exaggerate and bring more attention to herself and more resources. Some part of those forces that are aligned with her also want to use Islamophobia for election campaign purposes. Let me remind you, and I know it's very easy to forget history. 2008, we have a Muslim running as president. President Obama, right? In 2008, we had a documentary called Obsession that 29 million copies at the cost of $17 million were distributed in the Sunday newspaper in 3 critical states around the country to try to actually impact the election at the margins. And anyone who participates in election knows that elections are won by few percentage points. You shave few percentage points from your opponent, and you bring some of the independents on your side. Those documentaries that were put out in the critical states were attempt to try to get the elections to be won by McCain versus Obama, not realizing that the election was about the war and Islamophobia did not register at the ballot box. Move to 2010. Does anybody remember Ground Zero Mosque? It was not a ground zero, nor was it a mosque. But the term that I'm using, a ground zero mosque, is the same label that Pamela Geller gave this particular campaign. It was launched during July and all the way up to the election, and was very successful in key states where Islamophobia was deployed in order to influence election campaign, and it did play a significant role in key states, making possible for the midterm elections to be won by Republicans. Wedge issues have been part and parcel of political landscape in the United States. Remind you, the Chinese Exclusionary Act was a campaign that was actually launched here in California to begin with, and then it went national. 187, Proposition 187, which we are very familiar with here in California, directed at immigrants, was a wedge issue that was carried out in order to create a wedge and therefore to win the elections. Unfortunately, our own Senator Feinstein, played into it in Proposition 187, standing by the border where the Mexicans are crossing the border. Proposition 209, affirmative action, to try to eliminate affirmative action under the guise of the Civil Rights Act. That was a campaign that actually was designed by Pete Wilson, who was our governor and wanted to have a southern state campaign, using affirmative action as a wedge issue in order to win votes. Politicians will ride any donkey or camel or elephant in order to get to the seats of power. We should not allow politicians, whether it's the extreme right or the extreme left or anyone, to use our own best communities, our faith, our religion, our communities, of our different racial communities, our immigrants, as wedge issue for winning seats of power. We need to speak truth to power, and this is the responsibility for academics, and this is the responsibility I see is very critical at this time. It is possible that those who designed this film about attacking the Prophet Muhammad wants to use it again as a wedge issue. But sometimes the winds blow in the different ways than your intention, and therefore possibly the attempt to try to influence the election might not succeed, because at least the election campaign in this country at this particular time is rooted on economic issues, and Islamophobia at this particular time, in my own estimation, will not succeed in derailing or having an impact across the country, and I think we need to be aware. For the Muslim community that's here in this country, we have to hunker down, develop coalitions, learn from the experiences of other people. I believe that our history and our best days are ahead of us, and there are many people of goodwill in this country that are ready to work with us to change the dynamics, not only for the Muslim community, but for the 99% at the day where people are still protesting in Wall Street. We are the 99% of all races, of all colors, of all religions that are attempting to try to bring a different world, a different reality, and different politics, and I'm confident that collectively we'll be able to do it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Peace, shalom, love, happiness. Good evening. Alhamdulillah, all praises due to Allah. Praise the Lord, if you will. I can honestly say that I stand before you tonight, without any hatred in my heart for any human being. Now, I do hate what some humans do, but I feel no hatred towards anyone. And I think it's very important for us not to allow ourselves to be moved into the realm where hatred motivates our actions, our thoughts, and our beliefs. Because we need a lot of love today. I'd like to, again, from the bottom of my heart, send condolences to the family of Chris Stevens. Perhaps some of them are here, or friends, or someone who knew him, as he's a native of this area. But I think I would be remiss as a human being if I didn't send my condolences to the families of those 8 women who were brutally murdered by NATO bombs yesterday in Afghanistan. And I say that to say that oftentimes they constitute those innocent Muslims out there whose names aren't known, who no one rallies to express their outrage when they're killed. They constitute an excluded middle between the violence that captures the headlines in many instances. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm going to take my political hat off and put my religious hat on, so you can relax and see where that was going. Take a deep breath. Allah yubarik fikum. I want to talk about another excluded middle, and that's the excluded middle between violent extremes, as we said, capturing the headline, be those extreme actions undertaken by people who profess other than Islam or who profess no faith at all, or be those actions undertaken by Muslims. Oftentimes, there's an excluded middle, and that excluded middle is the moral and ethical teachings of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May the peace and blessing of Almighty God be upon him. Our Quran reciter, Qari Amar, recited a verse, several verses, amongst them a verse that expresses one of the highest ethical ideals in the Quran. وَلَا تَسْتَوِي الْحَسَنَةُ وَلَا السَّيِّئَةُ ادْفَعْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ فَإِذَا الَّذِي بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنَهُ عَدَاوَةٌ كَأَنَّهُ وَلِيٌّ حَمِيمٌ وَمَا يُلَقَّاهَا إِلَّا الَّذِينَ صَبَرُوا وَمَا يُلَقَّاهَا إِلَّا ذُو حَظٍّ عَظِيمٍ. That good and evil are not equal. They're not equal in their impact on our hearts as human beings. When someone does good to us and expresses good to us and shows kindness to us, then it impacts our heart in a positive way. And when someone does vile, odious, offensive, insulting things to us, it affects our hearts in an entirely different way. They're not equal with us, nor are they equal with God. This is what we're taught as Muslims, and I'm sure all other people of faith share that belief. And hence there's a reward for good, and there's a punishment for evil, ultimately. And then we're told, idfa billati hiya ahsan. Respond to evil with that which is best. Respond to evil with that which is best. In expounding on what this means, one of the things it means, our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in one of his countless bits, I wouldn't say a bit, one of his countless jewels of moral advice, he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, sil man qata'ak. Join relations with those who break relations with you. Wa'ati man harramak. And give to those who deny you. Wa'fu an man zalamak. And pardon those who oppress and wrong you. This is advice that Muslims are in desperate need of today, but it's also advice that everyone on the face of this earth is in desperate need of today. And it's a great shame that most people on this planet will never hear those words because they cannot move beyond this caricature, this mythological image that has been erected of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. فَإِذَا الَّذِي بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنُهُ عَدَاوَةٌ. And the one between whom you and he there was enmity, unexpectedly, suddenly. فَإِذَا الَّذِي. This is an expression in the Arabic language that indicates an unexpected, unanticipated consequence. إِذَا فُجَائِيَّةٌ. فَإِذَا الَّذِي بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنُهُ عَدَاوَةٌ. Why? Because sometimes our limited, frail human capacity limits our imagination. We can't imagine the situation turning out other than what we've been conditioned to expect based on past experience. But God has power over all things. And He tells us, if you can do this, then I can do that. if you can find within yourself the power to forgive, the power to pardon, the power to overlook, the power to take the high road, then I will erase the enmity in the heart of that person who is your most bitter enemy, and make him or her, as it were, an intimate friend. No Muslim should believe that this is something confined to the realm of ideals. This is just empty idealism. That these are just empty words. That these are fantasies that have no manifestation in human history and society. What happened to the heart of Abu Sufyan? What happened to the heart of Amr bin al-As? What happened to the heart of Khalid bin al-Walid? What happened to the heart of Hind? All of these people whose entire career was dedicated to the murder of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the eradication of his religion from the face of this earth. And they became people who loved him. Not because of some power that they might have possessed, not because of some vision that they might have entertained concerning the future, but because of the power of Almighty God. And if he can do it in that time, he can do it in this time. But we have to believe. We have to believe that it can happen. And when we believe that it can happen, then we will go forth and do our part to fulfill our part of the bargain. And we know that Almighty God will fulfill his part. Inna Allah la yukhliful mi'ad. God never breaks his promise. وَمَا يُلَقَّاهَا إِلَّا الَّذِينَ صَبَرُوا. This is something that will only be attained or realized by those given to tremendous patience. That virtue that we've been preached concerning, patience is a virtue. All of us heard it from our parents growing up. Patience is a virtue. Now is a time for patience, brothers and sisters. Now is a time for patience and deliberation and deliberateness in our actions, thoughtfulness in our words. وَمَا يُلَقَّاهَا إِلَّا ذُو حَظٍّ عَظِيمٍ. And it will only be attained by those given a great portion. A great portion of what? A great portion of spiritual fortitude. I say that without hesitation. You see where we're at. In these environs and in the wider neighborhood. This is the Graduate Theological Union. And if we can't talk about God and the power of God in this place, then I don't know where we might be able to do it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد. First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming out on a Monday night, Bay Area traffic, Berkeley parking, and I want to thank the president of the GTU, Dr. Munir Jiwa, also for honoring us here on the Hill, Sandy for coming up on a very short notice from a very busy schedule. Obviously, this is an event that's happened. We've been here before. In fact, when the Danish cartoons happened, I actually went to Denmark. And I met with the Prime Minister's office. I spoke to the Danish people. I actually spoke on Danish television, reminding them that the Arabs love Danish cheese. and that it actually harmed their economy. Believe it or not, it harmed their economy because there was a boycott on Danish cheese, which sells very well in the Arab world. And economics is very important, right? People like good ties with other places because they can make money. In fact, one of the worst things for business is war, unless you're in the business of war. Business people do not like instability. They like stability. These are very destabilizing events that are happening. I want to just look, first of all, at a few ideas, and then we'll get into the conversation. One of them, I spoke here on this lectern a while back before I even knew that we would one day own this building, not even a thought in my head. But I spoke about economic injustice, and I used Dante as a springboard to talk about that. And during that talk, I actually mentioned, and I used the word defend, and I mentioned that because Dante, according to the Inferno, has a character that he calls Mohametto, and Ali, another character, and it's believed that these are meant to portray the Prophet Muhammad and his cousin Ali as schismatics. Anyway, I use the word defend, pointing out to a lot of Christians, most of the people in the audience were Christian, that Dante did not put the prophet with the false prophets, but with the schismatics. So I was pointing out that nuance about the Inferno. Well, lo and behold, a remark really off the cuff, wasn't prepared, but a group in England actually anathematized me for that statement, saying that I was no longer a Muslim, that I need to make public tawbah, which is repentance, because I had defended somebody who had insulted the Prophet, which was certainly not my intention, but I was pointing out a nuance. Well, we're living in a world where nuance is no longer in our vocabularies. Right? We are in the cartoon world of black and white. It's not even color cartoons. So I want to talk a little bit here about the idea of freedom of speech, because certainly in the West, this is one of our most cherished rights, is the right to freedom of speech. I will guarantee to you, I've been all over the world, literally, I've lived in many different places. Freedom of speech exists all over the world. People speak very freely. In fact, in some places, they speak far more freely about things than they do in the United States. But there are two areas in many places that people are not free to talk about. One of them is religion, and the other is politics. But in the United States of America, freedom of speech means being able to say whatever you want about religion and whatever you want about politics, generally. This is the idea. And these are hard-earned. People died. There was bloodshed to acquire these rights. But we also have certain laws that prevent certain types of speech. And we know that you cannot shout fire in a crowded theater. Oliver Wendell Holmes. We also have the Brandenburg Standard. If there's a clear and imminent danger in speech that incites to hatred, the Brandenburg versus Ohio case. And there are other cases like this that test the limits of freedom of speech. Unfortunately, we have now people, insignificant people, really, and I would say, and everybody's significant in their own way, but I'm talking about people that, really, it's quite stunning that somebody, who lives in a house with wheels and has a car in the front that has no wheels, and he's able to literally create riots on the other side of the planet, who has a church with 15 people, right? Half of them are his own family. And the other half are friends, right? That really can affect global situations. I mean, this is really extraordinary, the internet, right? Really, I call email evil mail because it causes so much problem. Now we have to have these little happy faces just to make sure people know that I'm not being offensive, right? This is the type of world we're in. There's no nuances. People can't speak any more freely. Everybody's afraid, right? So, we have to think about incitement to hatred and what that means and being realistic about it. Nobody argues that Germany is not a free society. But they have a law there that prohibits denial of the Holocaust.
There's a law that prohibits denial of Holocaust. There are laws in certain countries. In fact, in Denmark, there are not laws denying the Holocaust. And one of the things that I tried to point out, one of the nuances in the Arab world, when I was there, because I was interviewed during that time, I went to the Arab world. What I tried to point out was when the Danish people said they supported, because the Arab newspapers would say 80% of the Danish support the cartoons. They didn't support the cartoons, they supported the right of the person. In fact, most of the Danish people were actually offended by the cartoons. And so these are the nuances that get lost in these things. Unfortunately, we had a presidential candidate say we should never apologize for American values, supporting the film. People hear that in the Arab world and they say it's an American value to denigrate our religious sensitivities. He was obviously saying speech, freedom of speech, but the point is, as Americans, do we really want to say it is an American value to denigrate other people's faith, other people's beliefs? We can criticize those beliefs, write intellectual tomes about why Islam is not a true religion. There are many books like that, and nobody gets upset. Muslims don't get upset. You can write all you want of why you don't think the Prophet Muhammad is a prophet, but to mock, to denigrate, to make fun of somebody who's dearer to the hearts of the Muslims, and this includes Jesus. The Muslims feel the same way about Jesus, or about Moses, about any of these prophets. Really. This is where we have to ask ourselves, is this the type of society we want? We have risen above racial denigration in this country, in the public space. If you denigrate somebody racially in the public space, you will lose your job. You will lose your job. There are consequences to saying kike, to saying mick, to saying spick, to saying nigger. All of these things have consequences. Why? Because we recognize that people have sensitivities. If you go down to East Oakland right now, if you go down to East Oakland right now, and you shout the N-word as a white man in East Oakland, and somebody comes and stabs you, is anybody going to be surprised? Seriously, is anybody going to be shocked? No. But what the problem is, we don't recognize that for believers, when you die, you lose your racial identity. But when you die, you maintain your religious identity. This is how the Muslims understand it. Now, I'm not going to justify anything the Muslims did in their reactions. I'm not going to justify that. The Prophet Muhammad never, ever attacked any ambassador. In fact, when a false prophet sent his ambassadors, he actually honored them and sent them back. He never denigrated ambassadors. In the ancient world, it was a declaration of war to kill an ambassador. This is a wretched thing that happened. But a small minority of people, and let me remind you that there were Libyans who died defending that embassy, trying to keep the Americans safe. And they are recorded. There are recordings of them saying, protect them. Make sure they're inside. And they lost their lives. And they would see that as a martyrdom in their faith. Just like Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi defended the Christians and the French legation in Syria against the riots in which they were attacking Christians. He went out and defended them. The French sang his praises. Even though they had conquered his country and driven him out of his own country, he defended them in Damascus. He was honored in this country. Kadar, Iowa is named after him because he was honored as a noble human being. This is our prophet. This is how we see our prophet. Now, I would argue that there is an element. I called this years ago. I gave a talk at the Globe Theater about Othello. It was after 9/11. And I argued that Othello, Santiago Matamoros was the patron saint that drove out the Moors from Spain. And so Shakespeare called this character Iago, right? The Spanish advisor to Otel. the more. And there's an argument that Iago was actually represented a certain voice inside England that wanted to prevent an alliance with Queen Elizabeth and the Moroccans against the Spanish, because Mansour al-Dhahabi had argued for that alliance. We have Iagos working on both sides, whispering, trying to get us to kill each other, to strangle the Desdemona of hope. I mean, this is what's going on, and we have to be very careful about that. I want to argue that when the First Amendment, which is such a beautiful testimony to the ideals of this country, when that was enacted, we tend to forget there were dueling laws in the United States of America. The dueling laws were actually a caveat to make sure that you did not use freedom of speech to abuse other people. You could actually demand satisfaction. We have one of our founding fathers was killed in a duel because his honor was disparaged. Honor is something real. People hold to honor. I'm actually a Kentucky colonel, right? And in Kentucky, if you're sworn in to a state public service, you have to swear that you've never been in a duel, because Kentucky was the last state to outlaw dueling. Now, in place of dueling, they brought in defamation laws to prevent defamation of character. Unfortunately, during the Warren Court, they had Sullivan versus the New York Times to remove defamation from public officials and public characters. So my wife is protected under the defamation laws, but I'm not. It's not equal. I don't think it's fair. You can't mess with my wife, you can mess with me. It's not fair. She does it all the time. But I want to say honor is an important thing. And anthropologists sometimes divide societies into honor societies and into law societies. Honor is sometimes in place of law. When you don't have a strong legal system, honor becomes the way that people redress problems. That's why in the ghettos, often where you have a type of lawlessness, there's codes of honor, right? You don't step on people's toes because there's consequences to doing that. You don't diss their mothers. You don't diss their fathers, right? Because there are consequences to that, right? You talking to me? You talking to me? You must be talking to me. I don't see anybody else here. You talking to me? Right? That's how it works in the hood. That's how it works in the hood, right? So it's very important for us to really think deeply about these things and the harm that these things cause, right? And finally, I want to say that if this country would only apply the advice of the United States Army from 1943, we could end all of the problems, all right? So I want to read from Instructions for American Servicemen. This was during the Iraq, when they were in Iraq in 1943, okay? Page 12. No preaching. This isn't preaching. You probably belong to a church at home, and you know how you would feel towards anyone who insulted or desecrated your church. The Muslims feel just the same way, perhaps even more strongly. In fact, their feeling about their religion is pretty much the same as ours toward our religion, although more intense. If anything, we should respect the Muslims the more for the intensity of their devotion. That's the U.S. government in 1943. I mean, where the hell are they in 2012? Right? If you should see grown men walking hand in hand, ignore it. They are not queer. Be kind and considerate to servants. Iraqis consider all people equals. Avoid any expression of race prejudice. 1943. Avoid any expression of race prejudice. The people draw very little color line. Yeah. So finally, we're living in the age of mockery. One of my favorite poets, Yeats, wrote a poem about this. Come, let us mock at the great that had such burdens on the mind and toiled so hard and late to leave some monument behind. nor thought of the leveling wind. Come, let us mock at the wise, with all those calendars whereon they fixed old aching eyes. They never saw how seasons run, and now but gape at the sun. Come, let us mock at the good, that fancied goodness might be gay, and sick of solitude might proclaim a holiday. Mock mockers after that would not lift a hand maybe to help good, wise, or great, to bar that foul storm out, for we traffic in mockery.
All right, thank you all very much for those incredibly eloquent and thoughtful comments. I know there are obviously a lot of people here, and probably many of you have questions. We may not be able to get to all of them. I have a few myself, but I'll try not to monopolize the stage. I want to follow up on some of these thoughtful remarks, and also to mention that Hatem just showed me the latest text, I believe, says that there are some 4,384 people watching with us online, in addition to the several hundred people here this evening in person. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions in general for anybody who cares to respond, and maybe I'll start the first one and actually direct it at you, Hamza. The whole question, you mentioned Oliver Wendell Holmes. There are limitations on free speech. There are certain things that either legally or essentially one cannot say in this society without serious legal, physical, or other ethical consequences. And yet, as a journalist who's been sort of steeped in this as almost a religion, free speech, and after Governor Romney stumbled, he then came back to denounce the film, but then said, we have a First Amendment. And Hillary Clinton said, violence in response to speech is unacceptable, which I think most of us would agree with anyway. But there's this always getting back to free speech. One of the concerns I have as a journalist is, where do you draw the line? And when do you say, well, that's going to offend someone, so we can't do that? You spoke to that in some way, but I want to ask a practical, specific question. Anybody else who might want to chime in as well, please do. What would you have done? Would it be a matter of expanding the hate speech laws, for example? How would you, in a legalistic framework in American society, create provisions so that something like this could not?
Well, there are, in Europe, there are laws, and they also have, for instance, they had an ad in the UK which they had banned, in which it was selling cell phones, and they had Jesus winking and telling them to buy that cell phone. And it was deemed offensive to Christians, and so the Ad Council, which is a non-governmental body that regulates ads and cultural sensitivities, they actually had it proscribed. In Sweden, which is one of the most liberal societies in the world, in Sweden, they had a punk rock concert in which they had Satan defecating on a crucifix of Jesus, and the municipalities outlawed it. And we also, we haven't had, the last blasphemy trial in the United States was in 1881, I think. Ingersoll argued it, and he actually made a very strong case that blasphemy laws had no basis in constitutional law. So, I think this is more about the outrage that people should feel, in the same way that we don't accept racial denigration anymore. I think religious denigration has to be understood as identity. I once saw, and I'll end with this, I once saw a panel in which Yusuf Islam was on. There was a Christian, and it was during the Salman Rushdie crisis, and there was a Jewish man on there, and the man said, where do we draw the line? He said, we draw the line on racial slurs. Religion has to be open game. And nobody pointed out, but I wanted to point out that that works very well for the Jewish community because they conflate religion and ethnicity. But what about the other communities? And so it's not attacking or even, writing against religion. All of that should be open. But the idea of taking religious sensitivities of other people, and I've been guilty of this, so I'm not gonna say I'm innocent here. I've been guilty of this in private and public, but I have tried to eliminate this from my worldview and from my understanding. And so I think it's about maturation, about growth.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Is this on? One of the issues, and I don't disagree with what you're saying, and certainly the offense and see some of the things that you were saying as well is powerful. The question of who has, or where does the coercive authority reside to really respond? We all respond in different ways to denigration, obviously, personally, communally, whatever type of denigration that might be. But when you look at it in terms of roles and structures and societies and cultures and systems, the question about where the coercive authority resides to do particular kinds of things. What I was getting at, context, role. There are certain roles that individuals have, there are certain roles that societies have, there are certain roles that legal systems have. And one of the things that's, I think, a shifting landscape in the Middle East, and particularly as you have sort of new emerging democracies, the moral authority, where that resides, is becoming less and less clear. But so the issue then is, where is that authority, and what's the coercive dimension of that, and who has it? And I don't have answers to that.
There's a present and imminent danger here. I mean, that's the Brandenburg Standard, and I think they're even though they had a legal theorist from Boston arguing, well, we can't apply this to the Muslims because their threshold's too low.
I think the issue of assessing that the potentiality for violence is imprecise. It's real. I don't disagree with that. But determining what exactly that may or may not, how you assess that, and at what point it rises to a level that is greater than personal affront. And I'm not minimizing personal affront or communal affront at all. So.
Maybe we could say that law is born out of social conditions. So the limitation in either way is subject to the prevailing conditions in the society. For example, we had separate but equal at a certain point, and then it had to be overturned because the social conditions in the society changed, and you had a movement to change it. Today, the American society accepts denigration of Muslims as a norm. And therefore, until we prepare the social conditions, which had to involve in a massive changes in the consciousness of the American society, engagement across the board, for us to come back and then constitute the limitation. Today, it's a free season on Muslims because the limitations are not there, and the social conditions makes it permissible, and that's the primary issue.
It's almost like a last frontier. If you look at Hollywood and Raiders of the Lost Ark or some of these other films, if they used some of the things they said about Arabs or Muslims in some of those films to apply to any other group, ethnic group, it would be completely unacceptable. So let me switch, if I may, and just...
My second part of it is that while we respect free speech, we also have to respect it's the free speech of the protesters to protest against their defamation. So why are we critiquing the protesters and not those who are actually, because they're exercising as long as they don't engage in violence.
And it's a good point. You know, people forget that there are people, could just show a hands of who is a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad or married to one, just in this room. All right, you see these hands? There's people in this room, that's their grandfather that's being talked about, you know. I mean, and that's an aspect that's not even thought of, just that you're defaming somebody who people actually are directly related to.
Sorry, go ahead.
And I think Dr. Donahue should have an opportunity to respond to some of this. No, I think that, you know, there's a fundamental ethical problem here, and it basically is might makes right. If you have political and economic power in this society, no one's going to talk about you. And if you don't, they will. And right now, there are no economic or political consequences for denigrating Muslims. It's that simple.
I would just, certainly this is an interesting position to be in, but the difference between an unfortunately disgracefully accepted practice is different than saying it's a norm. Because norms become imperatives, norms become more than just unfortunately, disgracefully accepted practice. And it might be a linguistic distinction, but the fact that something has become a practice does not elevate it to being a norm.
So I guess the question I have is, a number of you, Hatem and others, referred to the clash of civilizations, and in a way that this whole thing is very familiar, not only to, reminiscent not only of the Danish cartoon issue, but to the whole notion of, you could almost say that Cheney and bin Laden needed each other in a perverse way, not literally necessarily, but one side needed the other to vilify. And you could almost say the same thing. I mean, going back to my friend Hani Shukrala, who wrote this brilliant piece in Al-Ahram online, which I recommend to you just recently. You have on the one hand the extreme right Christians who want to provoke, who want to goad, who want to create a reaction and got one in this case and have gotten one in other cases too. And on the other hand, quoting Hani here, as for the Salafists, jihadists, and various other Islamist extremists, the film was an answer to a prayer. Not only did it provide a golden opportunity to strike against the revolutionary values they abhor as aesthetic Western imports, it also gave them renewed access to the nation's political struggle. Now, the question, and I invite you to comment on any of that, but the question I have is, why, is there a way, and I guess some of the efforts we've heard tonight and this very meeting is an effort in this direction, but is there a way to have people understand that these are fringe extremists who are making these arguments? They are bit players, people like Terry Jones, the fundamentalist Florida preacher who burned the Quran. I mean, these should not be important people. And is there a way to essentially say, don't take the bait? Or as Hani said, a well-known Arab proverb says that the faithful will not be bitten from the same snake pit twice. And presumably when someone sets you the same trap over and over again, you will have learned to avoid it. I mean, any thoughts on prevention or ways to say, these people don't take the bait?
Well, I think in speaking to the Muslim community and also our colleagues, alliances, and those that want to work on a better future, I think we need to realize that these strategies are deployed time and time again. And we are living in a small global living room. And if the two extremes are screaming, it tends to drown out any conversation from taking place. And I think we need to be aware the evil net or the internet has both a positive utility but also has a negative utility as well. You just Google any tab relative to Islam and Muslim and you get millions of negative materials out there. And until we are able to deal with that structurally, to counter all the negativity and present an alternative where cooperations and mutual brotherhood and friendship can take place. And I think from my perspective, our presence here within the GTU, within this area, can be a model of how we could create interreligious relations based on understanding and accepting our difference, but using difference to build something better. And that's the challenge that confronts all of us.
Well, there's also, one of the problems, people think that this is religion. Like they think these are Muslim, that this is an expression of Islamic tradition or teaching. It's actually quite the opposite. And just to give you an example, in Mauritania, where I studied, because they have a very strong scholastic community, when the Denmark event took place, they had a protest in front of the Danish embassy, but the scholars wrote a series of rules, which they called Adab and Mudaharat, the comportment of protest. And they distributed this amongst all the protesters, and one of them was, don't shout,
Don't do anything that is uncouth. Don't throw anything. Don't be offensive. Don't say anything to provoke them. Don't attack the embassy. There are guests here. And then the scholars actually got up and recited poems about why they were distressed, about what the Danish cartoons meant. And so that's an example of tradition functioning. Another example is the declaration that we heard from Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya. I mean, he's a traditional Mauritanian scholar who put out that declaration, and apparently about 11 million people have actually looked at it online. So this is a collapse of tradition. In Turkey, you didn't see any of this madness because Turkey still has a very strong scholastic tradition there, and the scholars are the ones, they use the Friday prayer to calm people down, not to rile them up. But unfortunately, in these failed states, you have these mulvis and you have these so-called preachers and scholars that are using these as opportunities to rile people up. And it's very easy to do because people are agitated and it's very troubling. And finally, I think, we have to think about how the Muslims are viewing this. A lot of Muslims are scared stiff. People here think, they're scared of the Muslims. They don't have nuclear weapons, right? I mean, the Muslims actually worry about these things.
Can I just add to that? One of the things is that I think the clash of civilizations trope is constant in all of this. I mean, when we look at, the initial response, we initially all fell into the trap, which is, it was a bunch of Israeli Jews who put out the film and funded. That feeds into stereotypes, the Jews and Muslims forever enemies.
I knew that was false because the production quality was so bad.
Right. and then we hear about it's a Coptic Christian who has obviously this is a very intentional act, and it feeds into again the stereotypes of Copts against Muslims, and so I think that's that all of these kinds of events have the tendency to reproduce all those stereotypes. So our task here is to work against that. We recognize it as really a clash of ignorance. On that topic, it's very interesting. I want to add that I think there is, in fact, a fundamental difference in the way in which we think about religion. The history of Christianity in this country, post-Enlightenment, has a very different history and trajectory than does Islam. And so I think that we forget that, yes, different traditions are going to have different kinds of histories, so you can't apply the way in which Christianity unfolds post-Enlightenment to an Islamic understanding. Having said that, in addition, I think one of the key things is that the violence that we often see in Muslim countries often shocks us, but it's in some ways it's not state-sponsored and it's generally random. In fact, we can say it's because of the lack of kind of democratic leadership or the rise of democracy that we actually see violence more forcefully because there isn't strong leadership to announce that. In the West, violence, the violence that scares us that comes from the Muslim world, ironically, the violence which was much more powerful and much more institutionalized in the West somehow doesn't shock us. So suicide bombing shocks us, or embassy attacks shock us, but wars on Afghanistan, on Iraq, on Iran, that somehow doesn't shock us because they're clinicized. They're made clinical and they're made to be in the best interest of Muslims, right? So that this is for your freedoms, this is for your democracy. And so they're couched very differently. So Talal Asad and Sabah Mahmood have written eloquently in their volume, Is Critique Secular, along with Wendy Brown and Judith Butler, and have really shown how it is that we need to question how it is that some forms of violence shock us and other forms which are much more problematic don't seem to have an effect on us. They're part of, in fact, the everyday because they're put in the language of freedom and democracy.
I would disagree. I would say because some forms of violence are put on television and some aren't. I think it's equally shocking. When we saw dead Vietnamese and people running out of villages burning with napalm, Americans were shocked and they shut down that war. And so the war makers learned, don't put that on television.
And there's freedom of speech issues because these are censored, and we know that they censored the coffins coming back.
You can't even show a coffin coming back to Dover
They were
Airport
censored.
Force Base. So I think it's a little different than what we're talking or reading about. It's what we're seeing. We see a few enraged lunatics storming an embassy, and it's shocking. But believe me, if we saw a few blown away Rockies, if we saw those 8 women on CNN or Fox, there'd be a lot of shocked Americans, and they would respond based on their shock. And the political the consequences wouldn't be so easily managed as they are now.
One of the most fundamental issues that stares us all in the face is what are the ethical parameters of the use of the internet? How do we think about how do we think about the ethical dimensions of what does and doesn't happen in the internet? And I think it requires a different way of thinking about ethics and about how you regulate or don't regulate, or free speech or potential violence. And it's just profound that what can trigger response, reaction, consequences, etc. But until we really grapple with thinking that through and what issues are raised by that, I think these kinds of things are going to happen. I think it's just an obvious issue.
There's a collapse of decency. Just
Sure.
common decency is part of the issue here. Right?
I have one more question, and then I'd like to invite others to come to the microphone. Khalid Beydoun, who's an adjunct faculty in critical race studies at the UCLA Law School, wrote a piece recently in Al Jazeera English website just a few days ago, in which he reflected a concern that many others, I believe, are having across the Arab world, which is what effect is this having? Whether it's intentional or not from the makers of the video is something we can only speculate on. But what effect is this having on the revolutionary image of the Arab uprising across the Arab world, especially when you look at Tahrir Square and how that was an influence to even people in Madison, Wisconsin, when they were fighting their union fights, their state union fights, and all across the world, this inspiration. This is what he wrote: the spirit of progressive reform that inspired the revolutionary sweep that cleaned out dictators Hosni Mubarak, Muammar Gaddafi, and Ali Salah Abdullah, and sprung up the pride of Arabs and Muslims globally, is being reined away by a renewed yet established seasons of Arab and Muslim vilification. I wonder if you could talk about that, your concerns about it, whether it's here in the United States or across the Arab world. Do you think that's true? Do you think this is an overreaction, this is going to pass, and we'll go get back to the sense of pride? I'm talking about generally in terms of the image, or is this a real concern?
Well, I'm going to take Egypt because I think it's a far more difficult state to deal with at this point than Libya. I think in Egypt, the election that brought the new president Mohamed Morsi in there did not really yet transform the centers of power in Egypt. The centers of power in Egypt still in the hands of the military, still in the hands of the Mubarak leftovers in terms of the economy, in terms of the interior ministry. And to some extent, the fact that the protesters were able to make it to the US embassy shows that the military and possibly the interior ministry withdrew their troops to embarrass the president, Mohamed Morsi, who was on a tour to try to garner economic benefits or economic investments for Egypt. He succeeded in landing a large Qatari investment. The Saudi government also indicated that they will invest in the Egyptian economy, and the European Union, he was meeting with the European unions for investment. I think the military was signaling to the Americans that if you want to go down the route of supporting an Islamist president, will be the consequences that you might have to deal with these extreme crazies who might come into the political power. We are your trusted hand. We've been managing the system in Egypt for about 40 to 50 years, and we know where the levels of power. So it more was a signal to the Americans, to the policymakers, in considering that Hillary Clinton and the Obama administration said that they will accept an Islamist coming to power as long as they adhere to certain principles and certain political processes. And as such, they were not putting their eggs on the military side. And I think what we're seeing is the political dynamics in Egypt being played. All politics is local, and I think part of this attack on the embassy is the local political tension existing in Egypt and being played out. Other countries, there's a following on that particular
there's
thing.
also the component of hooliganism. I mean, we have large, populations in these countries of semi-educated, functionally literate youth. There are no job opportunities. Some of these countries have, 25, 30%, which is the height of the depression in this country. And so these become trigger events that enable them to kind of express a type of frustration and rage. And certainly, these events aren't justifiable, but they really are trigger events that reflect much deeper economic problems that are not being addressed by their states.
Trigger events, yeah. Well, I would be delighted to have some of you come up to the microphone. There's a microphone in the very front. And again, please, if you could make we only have about, according to the schedule, about 15 minutes. We can try to stretch it out a bit. But please make your questions brief so we can get to as many as possible. Thank you. And if you'd like to address it to one of our panelists, please do.
I'm going to address it to all of you. I'm an Arab American, and I'm really surprised that your reaction is that this movie and what it had reacted in the Arab world is about Sayyidina Muhammad and about Islam. And we forget that this outrage was about the Arab-Israeli conflict and all the things that the Arab world had been feeling and the Arab public had been feeling. And you guys did not address it at all. And this is the heart of the problem of the Arab world. This is the way they look at it. Thank you.
I don't think that the video or the documentary is about the Israel-Palestine conflict.
The reaction.
No, even the reaction is not attached to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I'm speaking as a person that works on Palestine 24/7. I don't think that any time that there is an event that is related to U.S. foreign policy, that we only think of it from the Israel-Palestine lens. And I think it's for us to understand systematically, while accounting for U.S. strong relations with Israel, the Israeli Prime Minister is touring the United States as a surrogate for Romney, trying to urge the United States to attack Iran. All that is accounted for, but there are issues in the Arab and Muslim world that are not directly connected to the Israel-Palestine.
Well, also this event has enabled the Syrian massacres to be completely sidelined. And, that's another aspect because Syria was in the news constantly and there were arguments of we should be doing more for the Syrians. And now that issue has been completely sidelined and the massacres are still going on. Nothing's changed there, but this has become the news.
And I would posit, and encourage your response. If you look at Hassan Nasrallah getting out in front of the crowds in Beirut today, would you argue that had something to do with the Palestine-Israeli conflict and all those people coming out, or with him trying to restore his image after he's been rejected by the Arab streets because of his support for the Assad regime?
100% about the Arab-Israeli conflict. I am a Muslim, I am a Syrian, an Arab American, and I have been following this for 60 years. And this is how I feel. Yeah. All this camouflage about Islam, the West had started fighting with us since 1919. The peace conference, or I call it the war conference in Paris,
right.
They started dividing the Muslim world and the Arab world.
Also, I didn't say anything about Islam. I said, is it Israel-Palestine, or is it Syria and saving face and restoring one's prestige? It has nothing to do with Islam.
Granted, I'll just add this, that the level of rage and frustration that I've seen across the Arab world, and the work I do mostly is in Palestine, the sense of fury about the unfair treatment and how the U.S. is not an honest broker, it lies under so much that I've seen across the Arab world. Certainly that would be an element in the frustration, but I agree with my colleagues here that it's not all about that. Let's get to the next question, please.
Well, thank you for your insights.
Although it may come as a surprise to some right-wing Christians, I take the United States to be a post-religious or secular society, and I wonder if maybe the solution to religious denigration is for people of all faiths to work together, maybe on the model of the civil rights movement or whatever, to engender respect and to reach out in common cause that people might be open to whatever our religion is and see us as reasonable people of goodwill. What do you think of that as a movement rather than a legal solution?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I would actually disagree. I don't think we're in a post-religious mode. I think we're in a different religious mode in this country. That the forms of religiosity that are manifested in this country are changing. They're different. There's all kinds of spiritualities. Granted, the traditional forms are shifting and changing.
In Berkeley, we're in a post-religious.
Right. Well, but maybe in Berkeley, but we're in a little bit of a bubble here, anyway. But your fundamental point, I think, is appropriate, and certainly that's what we try to do here: is create an environment in which that kind of interreligious exchange, dialogue, etc., is created in an appreciative way, in a way that creates a civility and an understanding that does permeate all the different kinds of manifestations.
That's what Sheikh Abdullah bin Bay was talking about in the declaration, the idea of just neighbors. Like, I live on a street, I have a Hindu directly across from me, I have a Christian to the right of me, I have a Muslim to the left of me, and then there's Hindus down the road, there's a Sikh at the corner of the street. This is all on one street. We're not fighting, we're not throwing rocks at each other, but nobody's out there, protesting or denigrating the other person's religion. And I think this is what has to be engendered. And I think what we were talking about, the excluded middle, we have extremists in this country and extremists over there in the Muslim world that are dictating these agendas. I mean, and the people in the middle that are the majority of us, we're in the middle. We had a song in the 60s, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am stuck in the middle with you. So, this
Why
middle.
Don't you sing it?
This middle, which is the dominant, the majority of people, I mean, we're the people that need to speak up and just say, look, this is unacceptable. We can't let these people dictate for us. That are leading to these really tragic consequences. I mean, these people have died in this situation.
If I could just respond, I think we have to critique the type of religious discourse that have occurred. And I say there is a discourse of religion which is the success ministry, which is essentially saying, make your money and God wants you to be a good capitalist. But also there is the imperialist, what you call religion, where they see God and they see the prophets are sitting on a tank or F-16 and they think that's what religion is all about. And I think we need to critique those two representations and come with a different representation, which see religion coming from the bottom up, helping the people and addressing the human needs that are real. That's what's missing, and I think we need to call for a civil rights religious coalition that has been absent from our discourse for quite some time.
Can I just add to that, just to reinstate my earlier point, and we've studied this in class together, Keith, but one of the things is that if we're talking about religious, understanding across religious traditions, again, this need to really understand the different historical developments of different traditions that encounter each other. So in this country, what we often find is that a Christian trajectory or history is often imposed on trying to understand Islam. So the idea of the secular, which is a public sphere in which all religions are equal is a nice idea, but secularism as a political project in which everything should be conformed and all religions are conformed to how Christianity ought to be lived in public life is very hard for many Muslims. So when you tell Muslims, well, you know, the Quran should just be this abstract document that may or may not be the word of God, and you should have some kind of symbolic relationship to it, just as Christians have developed a symbolic relationship to the Bible, is fundamentally a misunderstanding of how religions unfold. And likewise of the Prophet, like, you know, just don't be offended. He's just, you know, an ancient person who's back in history, whereas in fact for Muslims, he's part of our everyday life in which we've embodied him. So it's an intimate connection. So I think as part of this, there's a fundamental need for us to understand that even religious difference, not just religious sameness, that I can appreciate your religion, you can appreciate mine because of the overlaps, but also for the differences of our traditions, I think is critical. It's not going away, religion's not going away anytime soon, and we need to find ways in which this kind of secular public sphere will allow for different modes of religious belonging.
You know, can I just clarify one about the ordinariness, that because I think some Muslims might have misunderstood that what Dr. Munir was talking about, the ordinariness of the Prophet ﷺ, that what he meant was that Muslims practice things that he did in his ordinary day life. That's what he meant. He wasn't saying the Prophet was ordinary. It was about the Sunnah is a living thing in the lives of Muslims, and that's what he meant. There was no, so people shouldn't take any offense.
Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah. I don't want any takfir or anything.
Okay. Next question, please.
Salam, shalom, and peace. What I have to say is in regards to drawing the line between freedom of speech. I think the critical element to be isolated are lies, because there's a difference between personal opinions and spreading lies with an agenda. There's the media lying to the public, social groups spreading lies in order to harbor hate with an agenda, advertisement agencies, political campaigns lying to the public. I don't know what to believe on either side of the campaigns. When I read, should I vote for this prop or should I vote for that prop? They're both saying the same thing, but one's lying and one's not lying, apparently. We're told in school not to tell lies, but all the grown-ups are lying. There should be laws and consequences for lying to the masses, as opposed to just lying individually, right? But if you're dealing with the responsibility, if you're Fox News, and you have a big responsibility on the face of the earth, and if you're telling lies, especially with an agenda, there should be consequences to that. But of course, the truth can always be bent.
Thank you. I mean, one point that you made that I think is worth, I think it was Hamza that quoted Oliver Wendell Holmes, and in that famous ruling about the fire, he said the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. In other words, if it really was a fire, there wouldn't be any consequences against you. But I think these are good points that you raised, but you also then you raised this whole question of sort of a truth commission. I mean, there are certain ways to identify things that are blatantly false, and defamation is decided in part on those kinds
I feel
of
like
things.
the American people should be more outraged at the fact that people are using these incitements to jeopardize the lives of American soldiers, to jeopardize the diplomatic legations in these different places, the embassies. I mean, this, it's a very serious thing. These aren't trivial things. And they know how to push the buttons, obviously, and there has to be more responsibility, that the power that the internet has afforded the individual now
is immense. And in the light of this, we have to reassess, what it means to incite hatred and violence. Because you can get up on a soapbox at Hyde Park and shout all you want, but you put that up on a YouTube video and it goes viral. And this is what Brandenburg was about, because it was inciting to killing blacks and killing Jews. And nobody would accept that in this country. You can't incite people to kill blacks and Jews on some public forum. They would take it down on Google. But this idea that you know how to push the buttons with these people, and a lot of these people, again, they're simple people, they're ignorant people, and they've been defeated. They're people that have lost their honor. Their countries have been overrun by foreign armies. Their lands have been occupied. Their houses are attacked and even bulldozed down on regular basis. Drone strikes kill innocent people. I mean, they just feel helpless. And so here's a time where they can just, utter this cry of despair. You can do all this stuff to us, but don't mess with our prophet. Don't mess with our prophet. And, they're just, people just look at them, they're just trash people. They're empty, insignificant people. And who cares? And this demonization is setting up for the use of nuclear weapons against them. Sam Harris argued for a preemptive strike against the Iranians, but with using nuclear power in a New York Times best-selling book, and you didn't hear any op-eds of outrage or anything. And so I mean, this is a really serious thing that's going on.
If you go back to the point I was making about education, the issue then becomes why have we become so immune to these issues? I mean, why? What are the cultural dynamics? What are the social dynamics? What are the economic dynamics? What are the political dynamics? What are the religious dynamics that have really made us immune to these issues? So there's not outrage. I agree. So you'd think that these things would cause enormous outrage, and they do for some, but not for others. And so what are the dynamics that lead to the kind of threshold of immunity or acquiescence or whatever you want to call it?
I think one big one is pluralistic ethics, that there's no ultimate truth, and so my truth is just as relevant as yours. And if my truth says I can denigrate the Muslims, I have a right to hold that truth. And if your truth says it's not, then whoever has the most power will get their will.
Let's teach a course on that next
semester.
Go
ahead, Hatem, and then we need to move on to the next question.
I think you raised an important question. I think in here, can we begin to critique modern academic institutions at this time? My sense is that we need to critique what I have termed to be embedded intellectuals, that we really have developed these embedded intellectuals where their role is actually to affirm and celebrate empire and become functionaries of empire. So you have anthropologists that are studying Afghan tribes, not to understand for a human council, but actually how to facilitate our imperial project. You have, let's say, just down the street where we are actually trying to improve our weapons of mass destruction. So we could say Berkeley is #1 in the weapons of mass destruction.
Well, also,
so it's a critique that we have to do. Second is the diminishment of the academic support, economic support, and I think as the universities have withdrawn the resources, the only place where you could make money if you actually become a specialist in the manufacturing, design, and research of weapons of mass destruction. And that's why the higher you go up the hill, the more income you make, not to say anything about the holy hill. So we have to have a profound critique of these institutions. In political science, we teach theories of how to extend control rather than to critique control and critique power. And I think it's very important for us to begin to fundamentally critique our notions and cartography of knowledge, the epistemology that runs. And therefore, within our institutions, there is a fear. There is an actual withdrawal from critiquing because you don't want to be the bad apple in the mix because nobody wants to associate with you. And therefore, it becomes a celebration of American exceptionalism, celebration of American power. And therefore, the university as an institution is coming under tremendous threat where both of our budgets are either coming from the corporate world or from DOD, and that undermines our intellectual capacity to critique. The role of the intellectual is to speak truth to power, knowing that the time they speak is when power is knowing that they will take you out of this place because you are actually saying the emperor has no clothes. Today, our intellectuals are not saying that. Actually, they're saying to the emperor, you have the best clothes, and if you could give me some, I could go and purchase some more clothes for myself.
Yeah, I know Sheikh Hamza is chomping at the bit, and Dr. Donahue also, but I wanted to quickly say that, you know, when Dr. Hatem, you said fundamental critique, I think you can go to a level deeper than the things you mentioned, and that would include, you know, thou shalt not kill being instilled into our educational curriculum. And that would include some sort of teachings that deal with metaphysics and the epistemological implications of metaphysics, as well as it deals with all this physical reality that we're trying to deal with. So I think there are a lot of things and layers and levels that we have to explore if we're really going to get to the root of these issues, that deeper issues that Dr. Donahue has brought up.
One of the examples that you saw on, you have all these pundits on the news talking to millions of people about how endangered the Christian communities are now in the Muslim world. And in the same breath, they talk about the Coptics being there for 2,000 years and don't somehow explain how they survived 1,400 years of Muslim rule. And live together. So, these are the ignorance and the levels of ignorance about the Muslim world in the United States are extremely high. And, the onus is largely, I think, on the Muslim community because nobody else seems to want to do it or is going to do it. So the Muslim community has a great onus, a burden of weight in trying to do that.
We have this new phenomenon of fact checkers.
Let's see if we could take a couple more questions. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to all of them tonight, but it's almost 10, and we said we'd go till 9:45, but we'll take a couple more. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. We're going to just take a question from online.
Also, I think you should let some of the women kind of jump the line to...
And we yeah. Yeah.
So a question from online for the panelists are, why is it that American Muslims always have to answer for what happens in other parts of the world? Thank you.
Well, I think it's important for our community in the United States to help make sense of these things. I mean, I don't see that as a, obviously we're not enfranchised as a community yet because Muslims as a group are blamed for the acts of individuals amongst them. And the best definition of enfranchisement is when individuals can do something and the group from which those individuals are from don't suffer the consequences of it. So Muslims are not even an enfranchised member of the global community because there's a collective guilt on all Muslims. So when bin Laden does some things, somehow all the Muslims are responsible for this. And like I said, Libyans defended that ambassador and tried to protect his life from possibly foreign agents. They might not have even been Libyans that killed him. We don't know that.
Let's take two more questions. Yes. She's the second one, so we'll take two more questions. Go ahead. She'll be the last.
There was a number of things I wanted to comment or question on, and I couldn't kind of sort through them all to come up with which one was most important, but I did my best, and I think that the main thing that comes to mind is, that recently there were these, this is a, and I guess now we're saying that this isn't, but in my view, I don't see how it's not a continuation of many waves of unrest that have been ongoing in that region. They've been against a number of things. They've been sparked off by a number of things, by a man burning himself alive, by, who in protest because he was smacked by a police officer. But when that happened, no one said it was about, this man got smacked. So why are we so mad that this man got smacked? It was like, well, he got smacked in his face, by this police officer because of the rampant, corruption and so on that allowed this to happen. And this was what gave people a sense of powerlessness in the face of, of the authorities and these dictatorships. And then the revolutions of those dictatorships were things that were extremely morally, speed up.
Sorry, can you get to the question because we're really running out of time.
There were extremely morally gray areas. Shops were looted. People were killed, often people who didn't necessarily have anything to do with the regime. There were all kinds of bloodbaths. There were black Africans in Libya who were rounded up, put in cages, and fed animal monkey meat. And I've seen the videos of them. They're throwing rocks at them. These are rebel soldiers yelling, "Dogs, dogs, Gaddafi's dogs," right? There was no forum like this to condemn the Arab Spring because it had morally gray areas or something. There was this idea that it was generally supported, right? And so there were morally gray areas. Of course, no one condoned those things happening. Of course not. But there was this idea there was a bigger thing happening and that we generally supported that. And it was okay, it was fine to oppose these secular dictatorships like Mubarak, right, who were massacring people. And it was fine to fight them in the streets, and it was a very violent affair. People were throwing things at them, people were throwing rocks at them, you know, and because they were under attack. And so all I'm saying is that this was fine when there were these morally gray areas happening, right? And it was fine when it was, you know, when that was happening. Now, there's a wave of assaults on embassies. The only thing that's changed is that one single Westerner died. And all of a sudden, we have this huge crowd of people, this huge crowd assembled, and there's this huge discourse on this issue. And so it makes me ask the question, which is, what has it come to be that Muslim blood, no matter how numerous, no matter how many Arab police, no matter how many of Gaddafi's soldiers die, what is their value in relation to this one ambassador, that this is what the international discourse is about, you know? And I don't have enough time, but I also wanted to object to this idea that racial denigration was over when, you know, someone then stood here and said the N-word in front of us. And when I just watched a video earlier of a white policeman in LA running a black man down, shooting him several times, then walking several feet to his body, shooting him one more time dead, and then we're not having a forum on that. You know, and just there's just so many things, you know, that I could talk about. But I just wanted to kind of put it out there that that is not like unobjected to. This idea that like all other oppression is gone.
Yeah. I think I just want to respond very quickly. I think part of what I was trying to get at earlier, at some forms of violence shock us and outrage us. So if it's an American abroad that's died, we're shocked and outraged. But the millions or thousands, at least, of Muslims who die, on a daily basis, and different forms of violence. You know, there's economic violence, there's violence that people suffer through poverty. We have different registers for different kinds of violence that perform different kinds of outrage. And I think it links to Harun's question earlier about why, as Muslims, we have to respond to the violence that's out there that's not often state-sponsored. When Muslims have to answer for violence abroad, there's a correlation often that something intrinsic to Islam and the theology allows for this violence. And in fact, we need to look at the socio-political context in which violence occurs rather than providing theological justifications for whether violence is permitted or not. So I think we're often trapped as Muslims to respond. We provide nuanced ways in which to think about the prophetic paradigm in our lives, and yet at the same time recognize that a lot of the violence is socio-politically motivated, economically motivated, rather than theological at its very root. And I think we need to be reminded of that so that we don't trap ourselves into this battle between, well, does the Quran justify X, Y, and Z, but rather look at the larger context in which the violence is occurring.
Oh, and I don't think that wasn't our consideration when we even discussed about having this. It was actually about these extremes of militarism and extremism. It wasn't about one ambassador dying. That's not why I'm here. I mean, that's part of the story, but that's certainly not why I'm here. I'm here because, I think people in the West do not understand what it means, for Muslims to have their prophet spoken about in the terms that people feel comfortable in this country speaking about him. And these things are going to continue, and Muslims will be outraged. And there will be Muslims that will act violently because Muslims are still a deeply religious people that are informed by their religious faith.
and in a post-religious culture in terms of its impact on the average individual. I mean, there's things in this country about Jesus that they put on mainstream TV that is so offensive to Muslims, and yet you don't see outrage. I mean, South Park can make fun of Jesus and Mary, and you don't see the type of outrage. That's not, for me, I mean, I'm just wondering, where are the Christians? Why don't they feel outrage at these things and get riled up? I mean, to me, it's deeply troubling that this is the kind of culture that we're allowing to emerge on our planet. And people, look, you know, these secular people, the atheists and the humanists, and there's plenty of them around, all right? But the truth is, they represent a very small percentage of people on this planet. The vast majority of people believe in God and are religious people. And as religious people, we need to learn to live together. And the only way that's going to happen is by mutual respect. And there's people that have agendas to create wars, to put wedges between us, and to use our religions to instigate violence among us and to make money. And we need to oppose these things. And that's what this is about for me. I mean, I just want to say no. Like, I'm against this.
Before we take the last question, I just want to say I heard you also on all the things that are ignored and all the forums that aren't happening, or they're happening and so many fewer people know about it. I mean, I live in Los Angeles, and I teach the next generation of journalists, hopefully. A lot of them are working in South LA, and there's a war there, you know, and people are dying every day, and you don't hear about it. And I've been engaged with it through my own students and the stories they tell, and I think that's part of the point you're making, and I just want to say I heard you. Let's have the last question. Please.
I want to make one thing clear. Hatred and violence is incited by the imperialist crimes of the United States of America in places like Afghanistan, places like Yemen, places like Libya. I'd like to hear what our leaders here, our Muslim leaders, have to say about the apologies and condemnations by organizations in here in America, like ING and CARE, that are very quick to issue apologies and condemnations. What do you have to say about that when they're silent, when Afghan women and children are murdered by US and NATO bombs and night raids? Nothing when innocent people are bombed in Yemen with drone attacks. And if you're going to be so quick to wrap yourself in the American flag and declare how proud you are to be an American Muslim, where's your condemnation right here in Oakland when Oscar Grant got murdered by OPD, or when Alan Bluford got shot by OPD? What are y'all doing? I'm a mother now, and I feel for life each time it dies, but I'm fed up with our community. By the way, I'm not a Salafi. I come from a long line of Sufis, and Sufis were not pacifists. They fought imperialists. My ancestors fought British colonizers. They killed them. There's self-defense, and it's allowed in Islam. Not only allowed, it's commanded that we fight back in face of the oppressors. That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah. I think, I don't think anyone here would. I personally, I said on the podium, I'm not going to apologize for a dead American. I'm going to express my condolences, but I cannot neglect extending condolences to those dead Afghanis. This is just basic humanity. One life is equal to any other life, but I think it's very important for us as Muslims to realize that you can get angry and lash out and say, to hell with the consequences. Or you can systematically strengthen yourself and build power so that one day you can have an effective voice. This is the way of our Prophet ﷺ. When Ali Yasser, when Sumayya was murdered and her family was tortured, the Prophet didn't say, listen, I got your back, Quraysh is in trouble. Because he realized that these people, they hate us and they're going to wipe us off the face of the earth. So he said, what did he say? Sabran ala Yasser inna maw'idukum al-jannah. Just be patient, Ali Yasser. In your suffering, your final resting place will be paradise. So as Muslims, we can pretend that we have power and that the Sunnah, the prophetic traditions related to the weak don't apply to us. But you have some people in this country who are one election from getting into power that feel it is a viable strategic option to drop nuclear bombs on Muslim populations, and we don't possess a single deterrent. We have no deterrent when those bombs start falling, when those cities are being carpet bombed, and those millions of Muslims like Sam Harris argued for and no one protested are being murdered. So it's one thing to have anger in your heart, and it's one thing to have responsibility in your conscience. And as Muslims, we have to balance between anger and outrage and moral responsibility. And if we don't, we're not going to build any power. We're going to be getting mad and getting mad last year and 10 years ago and 10 years from now, and absolutely nothing is going to change.
Okay, I have one quick announcement, and then I'd like to call Dr. Mahan to the podium to conclude with a prayer. But before that, I wanted to just mention that there is a program coming up on Saturday, September 29th, Empowering Muslim Voices in American Politics, sponsored by the Islamic Scholarship Fund. And it says here, join ICF as we discuss the significance of education and the Muslim vote and civic engagement and community leadership in this election year. Speakers include Congressman Keith Ellison of the U.S. House of Representatives from Minnesota, and Dr. Fareed Senzai, professor of Santa Clara University. It's Saturday, September 29th, in other words, a week from this coming Saturday, 5:30 p.m. For more info, 650-995-6782. And I'll leave this card up in front in case you want to see it.
Just to announce, I sit on the board of the Islamic Scholarship Fund. This is our initiative to try to get scholarship for Muslim students who want to study the humanities and social sciences. So far, Muslims have been studying either MD or engineer, and I'm waiting for the time where we have genetic mutations, and Muslims go to humanities and social science, so we're trying to incentivize it. Dr. Mahan.
I just wanted to say that the Prophet ﷺ, he said that he told, when they were writing poems making fun of him, he told his companions, this is in Sahih Bukhari, ألا تعجبون كيف الله يصرف عني شتم قريش ولعنهم يشتمون مذمما ويلعنون مذمما وأنا محمد. He said, isn't it wondrous how Allah, God, has removed these curses of the Quraysh and their damnations of me and to somebody else. They're talking about somebody named Mudhammam, and I'm Muhammad, because Muhammad means the praiseworthy, Mudhammam means the blameworthy. So when they wrote their poems and their slogans, they used Mudhammam as a way of trying to attack him. And he just said, look, they're just talking about somebody else. And that's what Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayat was saying. We know they're not talking about our Prophet. And it's interesting that these poor actors that were fooled into this thing, they actually had Master George was the name. And Imam al-Bayhaqi said one of the proofs of his prophecy is that people will curse him by other than his name. Yeah.
We conclude with a prayer. Allahumma anta as-salam wa minka as-salam. Tabarakta ya dhal jalali wal ikram. O Allah, O God, you are peace, and from you comes peace. Blessed be you, O exalted, full of majesty. Allahumma taqabbal minna innaka anta as-sami'ul alim. وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم وصلى الله تعالى على خير خلقه محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك السلام عليكم.
Zaytuna College, the first Muslim liberal arts college in America, offers 2 degrees, Islamic law and theology, and Arabic language, as well as an 8-week summer Arabic intensive program. Applications are open now. Zaytuna is establishing a new academic address for Islam in America with its new home in Berkeley, California. Make history with your support today.